helps us all move data from source to destination. Now that you know what Alteryx is all about, let's take a closer look at what this whole presentation is all about. Does anyone remember the 300 plus tools I just mentioned earlier? Well, when we group those tools together in various combinations into a single tool, we were able to extend the functionality of Alteryx by creating a reusable macro. Now you must be wondering, why should I care? Well, I just want you to keep in mind these three keywords: repeat, extend, and save. When I say repeat, what I'm talking about is, do you have an analytics process you perform repeatedly? Then you should consider processing your data in batches or in iterations. Simply put, batch processing runs a process that outputs data after each run, while the iterative reruns the process n number of times defined by the user. Extend. Alteryx is an amazing analytics platform, but you have probably hit a wall with its abilities at some point. If the default tool belt offered by Alteryx is just not able to meet your needs, you should consider building a macro. A macro helps you extend the functionality of Alteryx by combining the default tools to create a new tool. It even helps you generate data. Lastly, save. Overall, using a macro will save you a ton of time. Not only will you save time, but you will also be able to impress your bosses with your enhanced productivity. Let's talk about the different types of macros. First, we have the batch macro. A batch macro can group data into batches and process it one batch at a time, creating an output after each run. An example would be, you can have a range of S terms that dynamically changes the values used in the macro for each batch that runs. And after every time that batch is completed, that process will output a data set. Then we have the iterative macro. This macro helps us perform calculations in a loop on a set of data until a defined condition is met. The number of iterations can be defined by the user or the data itself. An example would be, a recent use case we came across was to perform a for loop for the full data set. So for every record that meets a certain condition, I wanted it to perform X or create Y. And this tool was very helpful in achieving that goal. Lastly, we have the location optimizer macro. The location optimizer macro is an industry-specific macro. It's a tool used by logistics companies to optimize their last-mile delivery service. An example of this use case would be, it helps determine the best geographic location for warehouses in a supply chain, something like Amazon would use to position their warehouses throughout the United States. Now we're going to be looking at the demos. So Michael will be presenting our demos this afternoon. Michael.
Hello, everybody. You are in the correct conference room. We're doing the Alteryx. We're doing a discussion on Alteryx macros. Sorry about the delay to get us all set up. Give me 1 second. I'm going to do a screen share, Ralph. You guys can all hear me, right? Okay. So today we're doing a quick discussion, or for those of you who missed the first 3 or 4 minutes, we're doing a quick discussion on Alteryx and how to use Alteryx macros. And I'm going to do a quick demo of the 3 most common types of macros. I'm just going to quickly paraphrase what Ralph was saying. There's 3 basic macros. You have standard, batch, and iterative. Standard's the most common. It's just simply a way to take your Alteryx workflow and make it repeatable. Batch allows you to take something and effectively group data into batches and process it in groups. And then third is iterative, which is kind of like a looping process. And so I'm going to walk you through now real quick how to create a standard macro. So creating macros in Alteryx is actually pretty simple. First thing, all you have to do is you create your standard canvas. And I'm going to put this down. Can you guys hear me? Okay. Okay. As long as you guys can hear me.
Yes.
All right. All right. Whenever you're going to create a macro, you basically just open up two separate canvases. The first is going to be for your main workflow, and the second is going to be for your macro. And the first thing I'm going to do is I need to close this. Okay. Go into our interface tool, and this is where all of your tools are for macros. And so let's create a scenario for a standard macro. Imagine you have a whole set of rules and processes that you want to run on a set of data. So first, we're going to take the source of our data, so our input. And then we want to, I don't know, let's say this is some data from like Salesforce and you want to clean it up. So you're going to put a bunch of formula tools and a bunch of other tools in between. And yeah, that's good enough for now. And then we're going to drag and drop the macro output. The moment I grabbed any of the tools off of the interface menu, the system automatically converted this workflow into a macro for us. So all of that was done automatically by the system. And now when I save this workflow, the macro automatically gets added to your designer's repository. So you can now insert it into your other workflow. And so voila, I have now created a macro. So at this point, all you need to do is I can take my input, take my output, and now every time this runs, this standard process is going to run for this particular workflow. And so then I can take this macro and reuse it in other workflows. That's the main purpose of standard macros. Personally, I don't use standard macros very often because they're just too simple. In general, if you have a process that you want to repeat again and again and again, usually I find that that's something that makes more sense for like doing a batch process. And so, which brings us to our batch macros. I'll give you a perfect example because this one literally came up this afternoon and yesterday, ironically. So imagine you have 4 or 5 tables full of data that you want to take and you want to copy and transfer over to S3. Now, you could create 4 or 5 separate workflows to do that, or you could batch the data and send it over in one workflow, in one clean process. Okay. Where's the output?
It's under preparation, isn't it?
Load.
Okay, never mind.
Under connection. It's called upload, not output, because we had to be different. So with your standard S3 macro or a standard S3 output, all of these fields cannot be configured dynamically, but they can when you're working with batch macros. And so what we can do now is we go back to our interface and we add what's called a control parameter. When you add a control parameter, Alteryx automatically converts this to a batch macro for you. So once again, you don't have to reconfigure anything. It takes care of that for you. And then the big advantage to control parameters is with Alteryx, you can now accept data as parameter of your input tools. And so we're going to call this something like object name. And then I'm going to connect this to S3. And it's going to automatically create this little action tool for me. The action tool will let me select a field like object name. And now any value that comes into the control parameter will change the object name of the S3 output. So, darn, now it's going to try and connect to S3. So you have to wait a second. So now at this point, what we can now do is we can dynamically change the file name of the S3 output by pushing in a list of different file names. And so if we can push in different data and different file names, we can now literally take dozens of tables in whatever system you're using and push all of them to S3 in one shot. So that's really the power of doing like a batch macro. Okay, so my BI desktop's going to spin for a minute. So I'm going to go to my backup plan. And then the last macro is obviously iterative macro. It's probably the least commonly used macro, and it is not intuitive at all. I've only ran into one scenario in which I would ever use this thing. And that's when you're doing something recursively, when you want to say, I don't know, you have a list of classes and you want to know what all their prerequisites are. And on top of that, you want to know what the prerequisites of the prerequisites are, and the prerequisites of the prerequisites of the prerequisites, and the prerequisites of the prerequisites of the prerequisites of the prerequisites. Now, the simple solution would be just to create a standard macro and call it 5 times in a row. Of course, if you do that, somebody's going to come up with a course that has 6 levels of prerequisites, and you're going to be in trouble. Of course, you could call that macro 10 times, and they'll probably come up with a class that has 11 prerequisites. Not going to work. So you want something that recursively goes through this list of data. So with an iterative macro, that you have the ability to do that. You can loop through a set number of times, or you can adjust the loop through your formula. Now, to create an iterative macro, like I said, it's not that intuitive. You're going to drag and drop your input and your output onto your canvas. But then you have to go into the interface designer specifically and tell it which input and output is actually doing the looping of the macro. You have to actually tell the program where you're keeping that count of how many times you've looped through the system. And you have to set some parameters, like how many times it's going to iterate, what you're going to do if you hit that max iteration, and is the data going to change during every single iteration. And so all of that has to be set up during the interface designer. And this is the one macro where you have to go into the canvas and actually set it as iterative. It doesn't automatically change for you. So this is very rarely used macro. Unless you have a specific use case, I would definitely avoid it. It's just easier that way. So then after you've done that, from there, you can just simply save it, and then it'll loop through all of your data one round at a time. And so in the example I have here is a very weird scenario in which I was literally trying to update 8 million records with 500 columns worth of data, and the processor literally couldn't handle it. And so I batched it up into small iterations of groups of 100,000, and it just loops through about 100 times until it's actually cleaned out all of the data. So a very, very odd scenario to run into. And I'll show this one for the next demo. Okay, Ralph, I think I'm going to turn it back over to you now for the next part.
All right, let's take a look at take a deeper dive into Alteryx macros. Let's look at the macro design. Macros can take on 2 design patterns. They can be classified as standard macros or global macros. As mentioned previously, standard macros consolidate multiple tools into a single tool. It gives the user the ability to standardize the output of data based on predefined steps that reside within the macro. The standard macro is designed to be unique to the workflow it resides in, meaning you could not.
Hey, Ralph, can you check your screen share real quick? Okay, thanks. Go ahead.
All right, you want me to start over? Okay, let me just start over. A standard macro consolidates multiple tools into a single tool. It gives the user the ability to standardize the output of data based on predefined steps that reside within the macro. The standard macro is designed to be unique to the workflow it resides in, meaning the macro can only be used within that workflow because of how unique it is, because it needs data-specific inputs, and it outputs data specific to the design of that macro. On the other hand, we have a global macro. It's very similar in functionality to a standard macro, where it consolidates multiple tools into a single tool, standardize the output of data based on predefined steps that reside within the macro. However, the functionality is global in nature. When I say that, I mean a macro that trims white spaces from all columns. This macro can be used in any other workflow due to the universal nature of its functionality. And lastly, we have third-party macros. Simply put, third-party macros are macros designed and shared with the Alteryx community by Alteryx users around the world. Here are some of the macros that can be found in the Alteryx gallery online. I know for a fact that we use the advanced join macro and the crew macros at ASU. I'm sure there are many out there that other teams use, but those are the ones I'm familiar with. And if you're curious as to what other macros exist, you can definitely check those out at the Alteryx community gallery. Please scan the QR code if you'd like to save, bookmark the link. It's a great resource you should get familiar with if you're going to use macros going forward. If you're looking for something, it's probably been done in the past. The Alteryx community is a good place to start. And now Michael will present us with the rest of the demos.
Actually, I've been on mute. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. All right, I'm turning everything over to you now.
Awesome. All right. We're in the proposal section of this presentation. This is a proposal I created. I think this would be very beneficial for ASU as an organization. And the proposal is to create an ASU Macro Directory. If you've worked with the Alteryx application to EDL data, you've interacted with or created a
Hey, Ralph, can you check your screen share real quick?
I don't know why.
Other screen.
Technical difficulties.
Sorry, this is all over the place.
All right, perfect.
All right. So my proposal is to create an ASU macro directory. If you've used Alteryx to ETL data, you probably interacted with or created a macro in the past. It would be ideal if ASU maintained a central repository to house tested and verified macros created throughout the university. This would greatly benefit our organization, from reduced development time to increased productivity for individuals that work with Alteryx. Some of the advantages I can think of, if we created a macro directory, would be increased productivity, reduced development times, eliminate duplicate work, enhancing existing data literacy efforts, and adding value to the Alteryx community as a subject matter expert. Now, how would this work? Simply put, we would create creating where authors create a global macro they would like to share, or a standard macro they think would be beneficial. Then they share that created macro for approval. Once the macro is vetted and verified for functionality, we then post it to a shared repository or website, and this can be within Confluence as well. It doesn't have to be an independent website, where users looking to implement any macros that they need for their projects could just go out there and download them based on their need.
I have a question, Ralph. I have a. You said people can go out and possibly grab that macro and do something. Why wouldn't I not just create a user table then and feed a user that information to a user table, as opposed to making the macro available?
So the repository is more like a place where you can share created work.
Mm-hmm.
And these macros are like modules, like almost like plugins, you can say, that you can reuse in another project. So I don't know how a user table would come into play.
Okay.
But if you have more questions, you're more than free to join our Alteryx channel on Slack.
I'm on Alteryx.
Awesome.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I was thinking out loud. I was thinking, oh, I could do that, but then I could just do a user table. But with the user table, then you have to worry about, other aspects. There's always pluses and minuses for everything, right?
Absolutely. But yeah, if you have any questions, me and Michael could take them right now.
Not at the moment.
So thank you all for joining us and giving us your time. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Have an awesome evening.
Yeah, it was
Pretty
good.
entertaining, right?
Huh?
It was a
Michael,
very entertaining presentation, right?
yeah, Michael, I may reach out to you. I started using macros a few years ago for a couple of reports that I work on. And I just never thought about the whole batch process. So, and actually the funny thing is I actually need to start working on one of my reports like tomorrow or something of that nature, which it has like a one macro fit into another Alteryx workflow that feeds into another one, so on and so forth. So I'm thinking that maybe I could probably pick your brain a little bit and maybe figure out a way to make it a little bit more efficient.
Sure, we can definitely do that.
Okay. All right, sounds great. Don't be surprised if I send you a meeting invite then.
Okay.
All right.
Go for it.
I don't think you're online, but thanks. This is great. Actually, it's funny you brought up Airtable. I'm getting a few organizations. Some people are starting to use it a lot more, and a couple of things actually, and SFTP as well. Right now, I use Alteryx Direct and doing SFTP like I go to S3 and then where I SFTP separately. I can really try to do that. I definitely do that stuff. But actually, both of those things I was about the networks out. So the desktop environment is pretty locked down. Like Airtable is, you guys have to like put special questions to like be able to pop the Airtable, or that would be, I would assume that would just be all locked down.
You do have it is locked down by default. You just put in a ServiceNow ticket asking to have that website opened on the server, and yeah, it took just a few days for UTO to spin it up.
Do they do it like for like I got some feedback if you want it. But is it okay for different environments? As there, a lot of people are asking here, get that way.
So we have the white list.
Okay.
So for the word space, if you want to use, you have to set it for the word side. So we want the word space, and then we want the options. Okay, so you have to set it.
Yeah.
Then you have, I think the other day we did. Okay. So this is Airtable. Airtable is very good.
So yeah, Airtable should be open for the server now, so you should be able to reuse it.
Yes, that's I'm assuming that we Python library, like all this like that macro you were using, I'm assuming you already as an embedded Python download or something.
It depends on the SFTP site. The first one is just a standard workflow using the download tool. So there's nothing special about it. Yeah. And then the other one, because it requires an SSH certificate, that was a Python library. So yes. Now those you can use by default. Obviously, the website you're pointing to, you would need to get that host address opened on the server, or on the firewall, but yeah. So you want to take a file, turn it into a CSV, then upload the CSV to an SFTP site. Yes. Yes, because it takes the data. Yep. It takes the data, converts it to a blob. Yes, we can do that.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, guys.